So what we were talking about before, we're talking about different cultures and the fact that different cultures look different, despite the fact when we do research on different cultures, we always get the opposite effect that we expect to get. Italians had one of the lowest, their feelings of positiveness it was completely different. It was they came in third from the bottom, and East Germany, which is the most god-awful place you could possibly imagine, that's really what East Germany looks like. Not only is East Germany up north where it's cold all the time, but these are the grouchiest people I've ever been around. I was actually in East Germany, of course, when I was stationed in Germany, in West Germany in the 1970s. So I actually went over to East Germany. These are not happy people yet. They scored the second highest when they were talking about pleasure and living a pleasant lifestyle, as bizarre as that is. The Italians, who are just the happiest people you ever want to be around, they came in third from the last, which doesn't make any sense at all, but there's a reason for it. And that reason has to do with the fact that, well, we can talk about Americans, the Americans and the Chinese. The Chinese are a collectivist country, and therefore when the Chinese, when we talk about humility, the Chinese score very low in humility because they don't think about it. They don't think about humility, it's just a natural thing. So when we talk about humility, they score very low as far as humility is concerned. Americans, who are fairly arrogant people, if you've ever been around us, not around other individuals, we score very high on humility, despite the fact we have none. So humility is very important to Americans, whereas humility, which is a natural thing for the Chinese, they score very low in it. And it has to do with the fact that everything happens in the opposite way that it's supposed to happen. The deprivation effect involves people valuing things that have little of rather than what they have in abundance. So if we have a little bit of humility, of course, this becomes very important to us. And that's known as the deprivation effect. Same way with the Chinese. So this is a psychological law, a psychological understanding that people have. What are we doing? Oh, did I not turn it on?
I was just wondering if it's recording. I think it's not. Sorry for
interrupting. No, it's turned on.
Okay.
I got
just
it.
saw the red light.
Since there's a dearth of humbleness among Americans, they value humility, of course, in the Chinese, who are very collectivistic. They don't think about humility at all, but it's a natural thing as far as they're concerned. And this is known as the deprivation effect. Subjective, we're talking, this is about research in cultural psychology. So that's actually what we're dealing with here. Subjective self-report measures work fine within cultures because cultural members tend to share the same response biases and reference groups. So as an American, if I want to do research in the United States, I understand our culture. So it would be very similar to the way I thought, I would think that it would come out. But as we have seen in other cases, if you go to another culture and try to do research, you're not going to get the same results that you think you're going to get because different cultures view things differently. Jeremiah and I were talking about this the other day. We were talking about Navajos. And the Navajo culture is completely different from the Western culture. And because of that, a lot of times when people try to interpret what's happening on the Navajo reservation, they get it wrong. The reason they get it wrong is because your culture is so very different. Now, since you live in the United States, people think that everybody in the United States is exactly the same, but the reality is, of course, you're not. I was talking to a lady that had just arrived at the clinic here in Saley yesterday, and she was saying, well, she's worked on the Yicarilla reservation up in northern New Mexico, so she understands Athabascans, and I was trying to explain to her that's not true at all, because just because they speak the same language doesn't mean that they act the same. It'd be like saying people from the United States and people from Canada were very similar, but the reality is they're not. They're more British than they are American. As American, as Americans, we're more individualistic, and as you know, the Brits are not the same as we are. Certainly not the same as we are. And as Jeremiah well knows, I'm not real fond of British people. I lost the spleen to an English goalie and a knee to a Canadian first baseman, so I'm not real happy with the people from that portion of the world. They're also a lot more competitive than we are. We are a lot more cooperative than they are, especially our educational systems. This is something I learned when I went to a symposium up in Vancouver. That the Canadian educational system is very similar to the English educational system, which is very competitive. So they're not cooperative like we are in the United States. If somebody didn't come to class and they asked you for their notes, you would give them your notes to help them out. But that doesn't happen in Canada. It's very competitive. They would go, yes, all right, you're going to fail that damn test, and I'll jump ahead of you because they're so competitive. Cross-cultural studies are possible, but one variable that cannot be manipulated is cultural background. As I told you about my own dissertation research, the research I did for my dissertation, one of the things I was looking at was culture. But of course, there's nothing you can do. You can't manipulate culture. You can't tell somebody, well, you're not supposed to believe this anymore. It's kind of what happened at during the boarding school era. We tried to tell, we tried to cut your hair and not let natives speak their own language to change their culture. But of course, in a lot of cases, that didn't work. In some cases, it did. The reality is that if we wander around the United States and look at all the native tribes, a lot of them have lost their culture, they've lost their language. This reservation is very, very lucky in that you guys were so isolated that they really didn't try to pull you off the reservation, not nearly as much as they did in other places, especially with warring tribes, the Sioux tribes. A lot of them, they lost their language, they just lost it. Because they moved them around the country and they forced them to go to Pennsylvania, where, I mean, how many people speak Sioux in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, after all? It just works out that way. Oh, here comes Denise. I don't know where you can find a seat any place. I'll tell you what, I'll move this. I'll put this right here. You can sit right there in front of me. Is that okay?
Special.
Yeah, you are special. The comparisons of cultures are not true experiments, but quasi-experiments. We can't really compare one's culture to another. Just like I was saying, we think of the English as just like us. We think of the Canadians as just like us. But the reality is, if we really look at their culture, it's very, very much different than our own culture. Now, strangely enough, your textbook, this is cultural psychology, your textbook is written by a Canadian. It's written by a Canadian from Western Canada. And it's really a fascinating book because his wife is Japanese. And he met her when he was teaching English to the Japanese back 2 decades ago. And now he's married to a Japanese lady. And he's writing about this because, well, he lives 2 different cultures every day. And we see this all the time. Individuals that will go overseas and they will adopt somebody else's culture. This happened to Chuck Norris. This happened with Seagal. What was the Kung Fu guys? Yeah.
What, Steven Seagal?
Steven Seagal. That's the guy. Steven Seagal.
Seagal.
They were both. That's about a seagull. Anyway, what were we talking about? See, this is why we can't teach in the same class. Yeah, we tell these stupid jokes to each other and nobody else understands what we're talking about. Steven Seagal, yeah. So when they went overseas, both of them were in the Air Force, by the way. When they went overseas, they decided to adopt the culture. They learned the Kung Fu and Tai Chi and all kinds of strange ways of kicking people in the face. And because of that, they adopted a new culture. And of course, when they came back to the United States, they became famous actors. There's other people that have done that. It's not that uncommon. It's not that uncommon for GIs to go overseas and then adopt that culture. It happens all the time in Germany. It happens in Korea. It happens in Japan. Why am I talking about this? Oh, we're talking about quasi-experiments. Culture cannot be controlled, but other independent variables can. As I've told you before, when I did my research, I was looking at resilience among American Indians. And the 5 factors that I used are age, gender, level of trauma, culture, and education. Those are my 5 independent variables. Culture became I was able to use it as an independent variable because I was looking at culture as strength in culture or weakness in culture. So I was looking at the same culture. It's not like I was trying to change anybody's culture. What I was looking at was how well they adhered to their culture. They embraced their culture. This is up north, of course, a totally different tribe, where they powwow all the time. And because they powwow and they dance, that would be them embracing their culture. Here, of course, it's a kind of a different story because you guys don't powwow. Not like they do anyway. They have what they call the powwow circuit, where they powwow all year long. And of course, during the summer, they're gone from home because they're out powwowing somewhere in North Dakota or South Dakota or whatever, Colorado. Anyway, them guys. After randomly assigning subjects to groups, a researcher can administer different levels of independent variable to each group. This is one way to do it. Any differences in their responses or behaviors that are observed must be due to the independent variable, as this is the only thing that differs systematically between the experimental conditions. In the case of my research, I was looking at trauma, and so they had different levels of trauma. And of course, one of the interesting things I found about that group that I was doing my research on was that despite the fact that they had a lot of trauma, their resilience actually didn't change. So whether they had a lot of trauma or not very much trauma, it really didn't change. Now, normally you would think that resilience would go down. The more trauma you had, or that you had incurred, the lower the resilience level. But with American Indians, it isn't that way. There have been, I keep telling you the same thing over and over again, there have been 3 studies where they've discovered that American Indians do not, their resilience level does not decrease because of trauma. It was my research, there was a research that was done here, and there was research done on the Tohono O'odham, which I know I'm mispronouncing the name of that tribe, but that they had, the higher their trauma, it didn't really make a difference as far as their resilience was concerned, which is kind of curious because we look at resilience all around the world with different groups, with different in different countries. One of the things we discover is the higher the trauma level, the lower the resilience level. And this is like the only group that anybody has ever seen where increased trauma does not reduce your resilience level. And you can look historically at this as much as you like, and it probably has something to do with the fact that, yeah, you've been through a lot of trauma, but you still have a great deal of resilience. As a matter of fact, you embrace your trauma, the level of trauma that you had. You talk about the long walk all the time. And because of that, of course, your resilience is a lot different than it would be for European Americans. One of the things that you need to understand about European Americans is that these individuals came over as individuals, they came over as families. They didn't come over as masses of all these Germans came over and then they all lived in the same place. It's not the way it worked. They came over as individuals, and when they came over, they may have been more collectivistic over in Europe, but when they came over here, they had to become individualistic and they had to develop their own level of resilience. And because of that, it may have changed the way that they reacted to things historically. This is something that Marius and I talk about all the time.
It's because we're getting
Morris teaches history.
We're the chosen ones, that's what.
A second method of doing cross-cultural research is within group manipulation. Each participant receives more than one level of the independent variable. Within group manipulation does not require random assignment because each participant receives each level of the independent variable. Each participant also acts as their own control. And that's kind of what I was doing. I was using each participant as their own control. Of course, I wasn't doing cross-cultural research though. Okay, here's the picture, and I need you guys to tell me if this is an offensive picture or not. It's an advertisement from Korea. It's advertising Oreo cookies. Is anybody offended? It's
By the
like
cookie.
Jeremiah.
A little bit by the cookie in the hands of that baby.
This was a very successful advertisement in Korea, of course. Sold a lot of Oreos. Koreans, well, I don't know. Their food isn't all that sweet. So, you know, are you offended? No?
No.
Okay.
I mean, probably just like what she said, like the cookie, like he's too young to have a cookie. I think that's what bothers me more. Yeah.
Woman's breast.
At least she's feeding the baby.
That's good. Were you offended?
No.
Okay, I was just curious. This is something that we had discussed earlier about breastfeeding on the reservation. Evidently, some people claim that traditionally you're not supposed to allow people to see you breastfeeding. I guess you're supposed to go hide in the bushes or something, I'm not sure.
Because we talked about it, we talked about it in our human growth, and we were talking about, on multiple levels, they all looked at. One, you had a lot of the younger generation saying it's her body, everything else. You had young
Right.
individuals saying, but then you had more older individuals who were coming from the angle of, this is good, because now we're having that healthy discussion.
Right.
But then you had more elders, and I said, how many would be able to convince grandpa or grandma about this and doing it in public? You had a lot of the younger generation saying, well, we don't say that to grandpa and grandma.
Yeah.
We don't,
Yeah.
it's hard to convince them. And I said, well, why? And again, it's one of those outlooks of, we're just never supposed to stand up to that. We're never supposed to.
Well, the concept of nudity here is very different. You don't even want to see guys without their shirts on, which is
That's so weird though.
shirts and skins.
We're talking about Navajo, right? But
Yeah.
a lot of the ceremonies that we do, some of them require you to take off your clothes. And
All
some-
your clothes?
Mostly, yeah. And they said that you can't be ashamed of your body because when you start trying to hide, and that's when whatever's bothering you, it gets to that.
Oh,
So-
okay. Well, that makes sense. That's
Yeah.
stupid.
So that's why I'm kind of curious, like,
I
so
know,
we can't
I
breastfeed,
know.
but we can do this on this side. That's being really hypocritical now.
Yeah. well,
What I noticed in ceremonies is like, we would, like the women's, if they're having a ceremony done, and some of those ceremonies, like she said, require you to take off your clothes, like
Right.
to sit on the sand painting, or to get underneath the cloth and smoke yourself, like heat and everything,
Right.
medicine, and.
But then you're covered.
Yeah,
you're underneath
but then
the
when you're like, you're undressing, but usually the men would just kind of look down. They wouldn't like stare and watch you. It
Right.
was like, they would have that respect to
Right.
like, okay, we're here to pray for the patient, and
Right.
I don't know, it's just like that.
Different tribes are different, I guess. The Crow sweat naked.
Well, same thing happens for men. Initially, when you go into a sweat, you're going in.
Yeah, but it's only other guys.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and we don't do a co-ed.
Mhm.
Navajo, we don't do co-eds, we don't do any of that.
I've
It's
never been in a non-co-ed sweat before. But then again, I've never sweat with the Crows either, so that's a little bit different. Yeah, they do sweat completely naked, both males and females, and it is a co-ed sweat. And it probably has, it's a ceremony, So it's very similar to your sand painting and your ceremonials with your sand paintings. Fascinating. Past research has explored cultural messages in domains as diverse as magazine advertisements, and of course this is Korea. And it sold a lot of Oreo cookies. Past research has explored cultural messages and domains as diverse as laws. In China, they passed a law in 2013 that adult children must visit their parents often. They didn't define what often meant, but evidently, well, in Korea, of course, well, you guys don't know this, but in Korea, you have to, they have a holiday where everybody goes and visits their parents, and if their parents are dead, then they go to the graveyard, and they visit their parents and feed them. Okay, but that's in Korea. Past research has explored cultural messages and domains as diverse as newspaper articles. After Trump was elected president, during his inauguration, they looked at newspapers around the world, and of course, depending on whether they agreed with the election of the president, this is from Montreal, obviously, they said, oh my God, who have you elected president this time? You know, they weren't real happy with him. And of course, there were different places around the world where Trump was. In Russia, they love him in Russia. They just love him in Russia, but they hate him in France. So, you know, you can go around the world and look at the different newspaper articles. Of course, you can go in the United States, and if you watch Fox News, they love him. And if you look at CNN or MSNBC, they hate him. So, I guess it's the same way every place. Past research has explored cultural messages and domains as diverse as fairy tales. The first fairy tale was written in Persia, Abdullah and the Fisherman, and Abdullah and the Merman, which is a really strange tale. He catches him, he catches the merman, and he gets him to give him 3 wishes. I think we've seen this type of story before. Past research has explored cultural messages and domains as diverse as children's stories, and this was found out by McClellan in 1961. This was Doyle and Doyle in 2001. Past research has explored cultural messages and domains as diverse as sports coverage. If you want to go crazy, go overseas to, I've lived in Germany and England. The English are gaga over sports, but of course their level of sports is completely different than it is in the United States. This is about it as far as the Brits are concerned, and they talk about soccer all the time. They talk about whether this guy's injured or whether that guy's injured or whether they should fire the coach of the national team. It just gets really weird. But in the United States, of course, we have a much more diverse athletic endeavors than they do in England. But if you go up to Canada, they hardly cover sports at all. It's really kind of bizarre. It's a little bit different. So it has to do with the culture. Cultures in the United States, we have sports starting in elementary school. When I was living in Indiana, of course, I'm from Indiana. When I was living in Indiana, they used to televise 5th grade basketball games on Thursday nights. There were no other basketball games on Thursday nights, so of course you had to show the 5th graders.
Well, you see that even on the reservation now. You have the whole aspect of, and they were talking about that, I think it was Wednesday, they're having their whole basketball playoffs, and you have students that, and this is high school, so
Right.
that's like their main focus, Resball. And
9 of the 10 largest high school basketball venues in the United States are in Indiana. That's how stupid they are about basketball. I mean, it's insane. If you think Hoosiers was a movie, that's life. That's life in Indiana. It's beyond insane, and everybody gets involved. Like I said, they used to televise 5th grade. I don't know if they are. I haven't been there since I was a kid, but I moved out when I went away to college. Actually, when I joined the service, I went to college in Indiana as well. And what did we do? On weekends, we'd go home to see the basketball game. I'm an athlete in college, and I'm going home to see a basketball game in my hometown. I mean, that's how stupid it is. So it's a little bit different. We have college sports, and Canada, they don't. It's just completely different than it is in the United States. They don't have college sports in Germany either. So if you want to play soccer, which is one of the only sports that they have, you have to play on a club team. It's the same way in England. Past research has explored cultural messages and domains as diverse as personal ads. How do we write our personal ads in the United States? How do they write personal ads in wait a minute, you swipe left, right.
Tinder.
If you accept somebody and you swipe left if you reject them, is that the way it works? All right. And so, what are they saying, trying to get us to swipe right? You know, what kind of pictures are they putting up? Or is it actual pictures of who they are? Have you seen the Pinocchio commercial advertisement where
Yeah.
he has a date? She says, "This isn't you." And his nose starts growing. It's just funny. Past research has explored cultural messages and domains as diverse as web pages. Web pages in the United States tend to be relatively simple. If you go to China, they're very complex, extremely complex. We wouldn't be able to find anything on a Chinese web page as compared to what we have in the United States. Everything has to be simple. We're trying to sell things. We're trying to punch things up so that people will buy things. But in China, of course, they don't do that. Everything's a lot more complex. Key point to realize about research is that no single study is perfect. I hate to say this, okay, Sarah's not here, so we could talk about how all research isn't good research. Every study has potential methodological shortcomings or alternative theoretical explanations. One important skill that students learn in graduate school in psychology is precisely how to come up with alternative explanations for virtually any study that they encounter. So you should be reading all research critically to see what's wrong with it. And this is the reason that I have you guys, when you do your article critiques, what I want you to do is look at the population, I want you to look at the number of people, and I want you to tell me whether this is good research or bad research. I want you to become very critical of what you're looking at. Some of it is crap, okay? I don't care if the APA decided that it should be published with just 13 people as the number of individuals in the research, but you need to be critical because some of the stuff isn't any good. And it doesn't say what you think it says. When I did my research on American Indians. Did I? No, hell no. I only did it on the American Indians of Montana. Did I do it on the American Indians of Montana? Hell no. I only did it on the people living in the area where I was living. It's the only people I could come in contact with. Otherwise, I would have had to have gotten approval from all the different reservations in the state in order to do that. So does mine have anything to do with the Navajo reservation? No, not really. It just has to do with those Indians out there. So that's what you need to look at, and that's what you need to read. The other thing that you need to realize is that when they talk about doing research on college students, they're talking about kids between the age of 18 and 21 or 24, and they'll probably give you an age range. But the reality is that a lot of these are just college kids. So can we generalize it to everybody in the United States? Probably not, probably not. But we try to anyway. Psychology gets a little funky sometimes. Anyway, this is something that we need to think about. It doesn't mean that it's not true, it just means that we need to be more critical about what we're looking at. In science, researchers and readers of research, of course, use the principle of Occam's razor. Occam's razor merely says that usually the simplest explanation is the correct explanation. The more complex it is, the less likely that it's accurate. Why? Because we can't measure all those accurate little points of reference. So it usually is the simplest explanation, is the true explanation. Of course, why do we know Occam's razor? Because we watch Big Bang Theory, and it was on the first year Big Bang Theory was on. They talked about Occam's razor. Before that, nobody had a clue what Occam's razor. Well, scientists did, but nobody else had a clue about what it was. But then it became popular because it was on Big Bang Theory. Do you remember that episode? Haven't you memorized all the episodes of Big Bang?
No.
Oh, okay.
The only one I
You mean
remember-
I'm the only one that's memorized
I'm
all
really
the...
trying hard to remember which episode that was.
I think it was in the first year.
Oh,
What were
jeez.
they talking about?
I have the first season.
It's-
I'll watch it.
It's always Sheldon that comes up with these odd ideas. Occam's razor. It's always the simplest explanation. Okay, so let's talk about the South. I'm from Indiana, as I told you before. Indiana is an interesting state because during the Civil War, they had more volunteers per capita than any other state. What does that mean? Why do they like to fight? No, it's just that they didn't really believe in slavery, so they wanted to do away with slavery. We need to talk about the South. The South is the most violent place in the United States. If we look at the Southeast, there are more murders, there's more sniper attacks, there were more lynchings between the 1960s and the 1860s. There's more feuds, there's more homicides, there's more duels in the South. Now this is really important to me because I have a brother that lives in South Carolina. I think I told you the story of my brother. He was married to this one lady, made 4 babies with her. She decided she didn't want to have sex with him anymore. That's on tape. And he decided he would start looking around for somebody else. Well, he found 4 women that he wanted. This is online. He swiped right 4 times, okay? So he decided he was going to go visit everybody, and being a genius, like my brother thinks he is, he decided that he would visit the person farthest away first, and then he would walk his way back up to Indiana. And the farthest one away was a lady from South Carolina. And he met her, and he didn't meet the other 3. He just, yeah. And it wasn't the lady that he swiped right on. It was the lady that she brought as a chaperone, just in case he was some kind of a wacko. He is a wacko, but he eventually ran off with this lady. There you go. And she's from South Carolina. So as Hoosiers, of course, were fairly liberal and were not very violent people, he carries a gun now and he votes conservative, which is kind of curious because he was as liberal as the rest of us before, and then he moves down to South Carolina. All of a sudden he becomes a member of the Nazi Party and starts carrying all kinds of guns. He's got a 9mm here, and he's got a 38 on his ankle. As weird as that is, and we didn't grow up with guns. We didn't need guns. I don't know why we. Haha, he's laughing because I need guns.
No, I'm just thinking of the whole.
What? Oh, you need guns, yeah, okay, that's good, okay. Andrew Jackson, the guy on the $20 bill, once killed a man in a duel over the honor of his wife, who at the time was married to both of them. She had married Jackson when she was thinking that she was getting a divorce from this guy. And of course, they didn't need to finalize the divorce because he killed him before she was a bigamist, in essence, is what happened. Anyway, and he, of course, is from, where is he from? I think he's from Tennessee, Andrew Jackson. This is how crazy things get in the South. Fisher, 1989, speculates that the South has had more tolerance for aggressive pursuits. Of course, the South is where they maintained slavery. Reports from colonial days chronicle no-holds-barred fights where eyes were gouged out and noses and ears were bitten off, as bizarre as that may seem. The reason that my brother married the woman that he married was because her husband had been killed in a knife fight in a bar. I know. That's a story for you. Wow. Otherwise, she'd still be married to this guy that was abusive to her. She really likes my brother because he doesn't hit her. I don't know.
It's always a good feature.
I know there's something
Yeah, it's
wrong with
always,
my family. We don't hit people.
I know, it's really interesting.
I know.
It's an apology.
And of course, he used to beat her up all the time, and she thought that that was normal because that's the way everybody is around where they live. You probably have never heard of this, but the English used to play this game. And in the South, they used to play a game called purring, where they hold on to each other's shoulders and kick the living tar out of each other's shins until somebody lets go. It's a fun game. They put straw in their pants so that they, I know, it's stupid, isn't it?
It's almost like quarters, but with your shins. It's not like quarters, but it's okay. It's saying.
This is them actually playing that stupid game where they kick each other in the shins. Can you imagine? No wonder they like
It's
soccer.
fun.
Yeah,
Try
looks like
it.
a good time.
Just kidding.
Classroom
Oh, weird.
demonstration.
Let's try it.
Couple guys here.
What?
We'll try it. We'll try
No,
it.
I got on gym shoes and you got on boots. I'm not gonna.
Are women violent too more in the South, or is it men? Always men who are violent in the South? I think probably men, right? It's like a macho kind of a standard.
Well, we're gonna talk about it just a second. The South has always been more tolerant than the North concerning corporal punishment of children, capital punishment of criminals. Where are most of the people executed in the United States? Texas. Texas leads all other states combined. It's the #1 place to get executed in. Gun ownership, they have more guns in the South. As I told you, my brother's got a gun on his ankle and a gun on his hip. Going to war whenever the gauntlet is mentioned, Southern high school students are more likely to bring a weapon to school. That is strange, and they don't even really have gangs down there. The South has more school shootings than any place else. Aren't we excited now? So let's go south. Why not? There have been several different theories as to why the South has evolved one way and the rest of the country has evolved in another way. It's hot and humid down there. I don't know if you've ever been in the South. I was stationed in Mississippi for a while. Really weird place, nicest people in the world. You don't want to go cross-eyed with them because they'll shoot you. Greater poverty, this is de Tocqueville when he came over here in 1835. They have a higher poverty level. A longer history of slavery where there is a tolerance for inhumane treatment. I was reading about this weekend in the Smithsonian magazine, and they were talking about some of the things that they would do. They would torture the slaves if they tried to escape. They wrote laws, and I was talking to another class the other day. We were talking about the Constitution. The Constitution was really written to protect slavery. That's what the issue was when they wrote the Constitution. The North didn't have slaves. So there were some slaves in the North, not very many, but they were mostly industrial, and the South was agricultural, and it was a slave state. And in order for that, they thought that the only way for them to maintain themselves was to maintain slavery. And so the Constitution was this balance between the slave states and the non-slave states. So you can read it a lot of different ways, but if you read it that way, then there's a lot of the arguments that we just heard in the impeachment trial, where they were arguing about the founders and the Constitution. A lot of this has to do with slavery. And if you don't read it that way, then you're not reading it accurately, because slavery was the #1 issue as far as when they were writing the Constitution was concerned. Nisbet and Cohen in 1996 posited that one factor that has led to more violence in the South is that the South was settled by herders, which has given rise to a culture of honor. Now this is really kind of a bizarre idea. We don't think of them as herders anymore, but the reality is they were settled by people who own sheep. Now what's wrong with people that own sheep? What's wrong with people? Well, they're herders. In order for you to keep your sheep, you've got to scare the crap out of anybody that would steal your sheep. How do you scare the crap out of them? You hit them before they try to steal your sheep. That's how you do it. Really? Is that what happens? Well, if you've ever been to Scotland and Ireland where they herd a lot of sheep, then you know that violence is part of their culture. If it's part of their culture, is it part of the culture here? There are other places in the world where there have been a lot of sheep. The Basque, for example. The Basque are that section of France and Spain, northern Spain and southern France. Those were the Basque. And those individuals never maintained their own country, as it turned out. They never had their own country. And the reason is because they were very tribal people. And so they could never get together because they could never agree on anything. The same thing happened in Scotland. Robert the Bruce eventually pulled them all together. But Scotland was just a group of clans until Robert the Bruce was able to do that. And how did he do that? Well, it was the English tried to invade, and at that point he was able to pull everybody together. So what are we talking about? We're talking about culture of honor. Culture of honor is one where men strive to protect their reputation through aggression, and that's what was taking place. Herders are more susceptible to violence because their wealth is more portable. It's easy to rustle cattle, it's easy to rustle sheep. It's easier to steal somebody's wealth because all you need to do is take away their sheep. Thus, it is important for herders to develop a reputation of violent retaliation to keep thieves away from your wealth. And this has to do with the culture of honor. So if somebody takes something from you, you kill them, or you fight them, or there has to be violence involved. The sense of honor has to be established before your wealth is affected. Thus, you need to be violent before anyone tries to steal your livestock. As curious and strange and odd as that may happen to be. The herder culture of honor is not limited to the United States, but may have been brought here by the Scots-Irish, who made up the lion's share of people settling in the South, especially in the South. So if you look at the names of the plantations in the South, there are Scottish names. There are some Irish names, but they tried to change that. There were a lot of Englishmen that came over and settled in the South. And these individuals were herders in the old country. When they came over here, they had that same sense of honor. Herders around the world maintain this bloviated code of honor. You hit them before they try to steal from you, as weird as that sounds. Does this all make sense?
Well, you see it on the reservation.
Yeah.
That's the reason why I mean, herding sheep was literally a way of life. And
Sure.
if you didn't have it, then you weren't considered. I mean,
You
that
didn't
was
have
your-
any money.
Yeah, that was your wealth. That was.
And is there a similar code of honor then linked to that?
Well, yeah. I mean, they would, if you stole, they would go after you. I mean, back in the old days, that was how you would do it. You would go after them and hunt them down because you're stealing. That was their livelihood. That was their complete livelihood. And if you stole that, then initially, we're going to go after you. We're going to hunt you down. And
Well, think of the Western culture, the cowboy culture. If somebody rustled cattle from you, you hung them. You didn't play games with them. You didn't arrest them and take them to jail.
yeah,
You just killed them.
kill them.
And if they stole your horse, once again, what do? You just kill them. You hang them from the highest tree. Hopefully you can find them.
Especially res.
Looking at archival data, Nisbet and Cohen in 1997 found that when you compared records of the rural North with the rural South, they found that not only was the homicide rate higher, but when you compared herding regions of the South with farming regions of the South, the homicide rate was twice that in the herding region, as bizarre as that sounds. So what's wrong with my brother? Well, Indiana is a farming state. We did have livestock, but not very much, just enough to feed your family for the winter, or just enough to milk cows and give you some ready income. But it was a farming state. So where does my brother move? He moves to South Carolina, and all of a sudden he's packing. Now he's packing, and like I said, he's got two weapons. One on his ankle and one on his hip. Now the bizarre part is when he comes up to Indiana, when he visits Indiana, he doesn't pack. I know, he takes his gun out and he puts it in a lockbox in his vehicle. And he doesn't pack for two reasons. One, it's against the law in Indiana to have you can have a concealed permit, but you have to be a resident of the state to have one. If you're a resident from another state, you can't have a concealed permit or whatever it is, concealed weapon permit. The other thing is in Indiana, you can't have a loaded weapon. You can only have a weapon Even if it's in your car, you have to have the gun in one place and the ammunition in another place, so that you can't even put the weapon together, so that you could shoot somebody. In other words, you have to have the ammunition in the trunk and the gun in your glove box, or vice versa. You can't have them in the same place. If you do, it's against the law. Now, why in the world would Indiana have laws like that? What the hell has Indiana done that they would need a law like that? Where if you had a loaded gun, and you were carrying a loaded weapon, you would be in trouble. Well, you have to remember Chicago's right next to Indiana. And Indiana had a lot of problems with the gangsters from Chicago coming down into Indiana and, shooting all their victims and then leaving them there. So they had to have a way of stopping these gangsters from coming across the border. So that's the way they did it. If they found somebody with a loaded weapon on their person or in their vehicle, they needed to be able to arrest the guy. And so you remember John Dillinger's from Indiana. And of course, Dillinger was, anyway, not that that's important. Okay, so now you understand why Indiana has the laws that they have. It was to control the gangsters from Chicago. Cohen and Nisbet in 1994 next conducted telephone interviews of Northerners and Southerners and discovered that while they had similar negative feelings about violence, Southerners were more likely to have positive attitudes toward defending their families or their honor. This gets really weird. So they decided that they would do research, and this is the research that they did. They noted that testosterone rises when men are ready to aggress. Nisbet and Cohen et al. Arranged for Northern and Southern students to be put in a vaguely insulting situation. He then measured the testosterone of each participant. So they were insulted, both Northerners and Southerners. They're all males, of course. Yes, we are talking about males. We're not talking about females. Measuring testosterone from saliva samples, the researchers discovered that while the Northern students reacted minimally to the insult, from 4 to 5 milligrams, they went from 4 to 5 milligrams, so they did react to some extent. The Southern students were ready to aggress after the insult to a testosterone level of 12.5 milligrams. They went from 4 milligrams to 12.5 milligrams, just from an insult. So what's the probability they're going to get into a dust-up just because somebody insulted them? Well, it's a lot higher if they're from the South than if they're from the North. I've had girlfriends from the South. This is really weird. And they wanted me to beat up their old boyfriends because now I'm their new boyfriend. They wanted me to get in a fight with somebody just because, okay.
You did.
Well, you think it's funny.
You did, didn't you?
I did not.
You were like, let's do.
I'm from the North.
We're gonna purr. We're gonna start purring right now.
And I thought they were laughing. I thought they were kidding. I thought it was a joke. They weren't kidding at all. That's what they were used to, where they come from.
That happens even on the reservation now.
Do you attract aggressive women?
I'm not sure what kind of women I attract. Usually I don't attract any women, so I don't really know how that
I mean, like
works.
one shot you and stabbed you. And
That was my first wife, and she was from Indiana, so that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? And my next wife was from Georgia. Not just Georgia, but from the swamps of Georgia, from down in the Okefenokee swamp.
So you should have just yelled out, Indiana, why are you trying to shoot me? You separate the gun and the weapon. No.
But she had been married to a guy from the South who was kind of aggressive, kind of mean, kind of abusive.
First one or
Let's
the
call it
second one?
abusive. She liked the fact that I didn't hit her. Not a hitter, not a puncher. Okay, so let's do some more research. Cohen and his colleagues in 1996 conducted a similar study to where they forced the participants into a narrow hallway with a much larger person, a big guy. What they were measuring was how long it took the participants to step out of the Man Mountain's way, a game of human chicken. So, I know, this sounds so bizarre, doesn't it? So they were trying to figure out when they would step out of the way. The situation was set up by either insulting the participant before they played hallway chicken or not. Northerners reacted in a similar manner whether they were insulted or not. They moved 60 inches before they approached the individual, or 75 inches if they weren't insulted. If they were insulted, they moved at 60 inches. Yeah.
That's pretty interesting.
Southerners, on the other hand, stepped out of the way earlier when they were not insulted, 110 inches. They stepped out of the guy's way. That's Southern hospitality for you. But after the insult, they approached the man mountain on average 35 inches before they veered out of the way. If they were insulted. So their testosterone was up. They were playing a game of honor, culture of honor.
Is that when they were insulted before putting him in the hallway, or
If they
just
were
the guy?
insulted, if they were insulted, they came right up to the guy and then they veered off. I mean, it was obvious, he was big as a truck, so they had to get out of the way. But if they weren't insulted, then they veered out of the way long before he got there, 110 inches. As weird as that is. Okay.
Don't go to the south.
Don't go to the south. No, that's not what that's not why I'm saying, I'm telling you this. I'm trying to explain my brother.
The violent south.
My violent brother, who's not really violent. He plays with his guns, but I don't think he's ever shot, not at anybody anyway.
I can offer a funny story about that word packing you used. I was driving from my dad's through Globe, Arizona, down to Tucson, and I wanted to stop and go for a hike. And I was asking this woman in the gas station where I should hike. And she told me a couple places, and then she says, "But are you packing?" And having never heard that before, I thought she meant backpacking. And I said, no, just a day hike. And she says, "I mean, are you packing?" And I don't know, somehow we communicated to have a gun. I'm like, "No, what would I have a gun for?" She's like, "Well, I don't know, she don't like animals and people." I'm like, "Oh no, I think I'll be good." I mean,
People.
yeah. It was such a weird encounter, and I thought, well, that does reflect that kind of, there's a bit of a gun, is there kind of a gun culture? And I think there is sort of in the rural areas of Arizona in general.
Oh, there's.
That was in Globe.
There is, because, I mean, out here you have, on the reservation, you have gangs. And that's the reason why we were talking one time, we were talking about the aspect of, say for example, you go over the mountain or you go to certain regions, like you go to Pinyon, you have to, everybody knows Pinyon for that reason.
Right.
Because one, you have to make sure.
Lots of guns.
Lots of guns, a lot of gang violence. And sadly, when we look at it from a law enforcement outlook, because I work a lot with law enforcement, their response time is either 2 to 3 to 5 hours, or even at times they don't even show up. So that's one of the things we're always concerned with. So again, what do most individuals do? They go from the vigilante outlook of, I'm going to have this level of vigilante justice and I'm going to carry my own firearm. But again, it's one of those things where it just becomes, I think, a learned behavior. You just simply,
Yeah.
unless you're,
Yeah.
It's Pinyon not bad. She's all
Oh, yeah.
I'm
you're
from
Pinyon.
Pinyon.
You're from Pinyon.
well, we would go out there.
It used to be that bad, didn't
It used to be, but when me and my boyfriend kind of like go out onto other reservations like Kienta, Chinle, and Gallup, and we're like, people think Pinyon is bad. Other places are worse, and I don't know. I don't think, it's still kind of bad, but not to the extent where people think like someone has a gun out in bashes or something.
Well, they've shot up bashes.
That was like 5-7 years ago now.
They still shot the place up.
But somebody died in front of the laundromat in Chinle not too recently. Like,
Somebody shot him?
yeah.
Oh, okay.
And then people in the laundromat were like, "Oh, look at that," and then they just stick it inside.
Not as bad as, what, it was a direction of a guy versus Pinyon, they just shot up bashes. That's when we're like, what are you taking out on the building? It's not a specific guy.
What time does this class stop? 2:50?
250.
I got 4 minutes. Oh, man. Universal brains developing culturally variable minds. One key adaptation that enabled humans to distinguish themselves from their proto-chimpanzee ancestors was the ability to learn and accumulate cultural information as well as we have. And in order for cultures to survive, we've had to learn all of this information. We can do it, chimpanzees can't. great apes can't, but we as humans can. This adaptation allowed humans to learn the requisite technologies and skills just to stake out a successful existence in such diverse environments as the ice-encased Arctic hinterlands, the thick Amazonian jungle, the parched Kalahari Desert, and the dog-eat-dog corporate world of Wall Street. If we look at all these different cultures, humans have been able to adapt to just about anything. And this is one of the questions that we have about Neanderthal man. Why in the world, if his brain was so much bigger than ours, and it was, about 250 milligrams bigger than ours is, why in the world did we survive and he didn't? And this is a question that keeps coming up. And if you look at the debate as to whether Neanderthal man was so far behind us, the reality was he wasn't. And some of the things that he had, we have now. And we have his genes. You have his genes, I have his genes. Everybody has his genes except people who live in Africa, because they never left Africa. And that's, the Neanderthals are out. So if anybody who is not in Africa has Neanderthal genes. Some of us have more than others. My uncle could have been he looked exactly like the Neanderthal man. I know. So potentially I have more Neanderthal genes than anybody else, but then again, my ancestors come from France, they come from Germany, they come from where the Neanderthal man actually was. Why are we talking about this? We're talking about adaptation. Somehow he was able to survive in the Ice Age, during the Ice Age. How in the world was he able to do that? Well, one way that he was able to do that was his skin became paler, so it absorbed more sunlight. Those people with darker skin, of course, they reflect the sunlight more, they don't get as much vitamin D. But as Neanderthal man, of course, it was foggy all the time, it was cold, he had to cover himself up, and he needed to absorb as much vitamin D as possible for him to survive. How else did he do it? How else did he do it? His weapons were very similar to modern man's. Why didn't Neanderthal man, if he had such a larger brain, why didn't he survive and modern man not survive?
I think he swiped right on the wrong person.
Swiped right on the wrong person. Obviously, modern man and Neanderthal man were able to reproduce together. They weren't different species because we all have Neanderthal genes. We do. We all have Neanderthal genes. It doesn't matter whether you're native or whether you're from the Philippines or whether you're from South America. We all have Neanderthal genes, as it turns out. I don't know. Is it time to stop? I guess it is. We'll stop right here. Okay.